I guess if you don't like the Bible, change it. Well, not really, but this was the suggestion by two Puritans to King James. They suggested that a new translation of the Bible be produced by the Crown to unify the Anglican Church in England and Scotland. King James thought this was a worthy endeavor. After all, he would be able to control the English version of the Bible while also eliminating the influence of the anti-Crown commentaries. This brings us to our next date in July, July 26, 1603, the day King James of Scotland was crowned King James I of England. He commissioned and chartered a new translation of the Bible, which would eventually become the most famous English version, the King James Version.
Acceptance by the general public of the King's Authorized Version took some time. The Geneva Bible was still very popular and large numbers were imported from Amsterdam. But in 1637, Archbishop Laud prohibited the printing or importation of the Geneva Bible. In the first half of the 17th century, the King's Authorized Version is most commonly referred to as the Bible without notes, thereby distinguishing it from the Geneva, the Bible with notes.
The King James translation was done by a panel of 6 translators, 47 men in all, most of whom were leading biblical scholars in England. They divided up into teams, one for the Old Testament and one for the New Testament. King James instructed the translators to keep the new version familiar to its listeners and readers. In other words, he wanted to make it in the everyday vernacular of the people.
King James desired to unify the Anglican Church with one common book. Eventually, the King's Authorized Version became the only current version circulating among the English-speaking people. Once again, the translation had its critics. As with the earlier Tyndale translation, the argument of word-for-word translation versus common everyday vernacular was divisive. Hugh Broughton, a highly regarded English Hebraist, issued a total condemnation of the King's Authorized Version. He especially criticized the fact that the translators did not use word-for-word equivalents and stated that he would rather be torn in pieces by wild horses than that this abominable translation should ever be foisted upon the English people.
It should be noted that he was excluded from the panel of translators due to his volatile personality.
Disputes like these did not stop the distribution of the King James Authorized Version. Over the course of the 18th century, the King James Version became the standard for English-speaking scholars. It became regarded by some as an inspired text in itself, so much so that any challenge to its textual base became an assault on Holy Scripture itself.
Over time, printers from all over the country began to profit and print the authorized King James Version of the Bible. While more Bibles in more places was an important advancement, the accuracy of the translation suffered, eventually adding up to more than 1,500 misprints in Scripture. One of the more embarrassing misprints was the omission of "not" from the commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." The printer guilty of this error subsequently lost his license, and probably his marriage too.
As the story goes, the original printing was made before English spelling was standardized. When space on a page needed to be added or saved, printers would add words or change spelling in order to accommodate. By the mid-18th century, the standards of spelling, punctuation, typesetting, capitalization, and grammar had changed radically since the first edition of the Authorized Version. Additionally, printers continued to introduce changes to their Bible texts. This allowed them to bring them into line with current practice and with public expectations. It also standardized spelling and grammatical construction. By the middle part of the 18th century, Oxford and Cambridge were looking to update the Authorized Version. They sought to re-establish credibility of the text. The Cambridge edition was released first in 1760. This was the grand finale of its creator, Francis Sawyer Parris, who shortly after publication passed away. 9 years after the Cambridge edition, the Oxford edition was released by Benjamin Blayney. This edition sought to carry the torch of one great translation to another. Very few changes were made compared to Parris's edition, but it's been the Oxford Standard text that has endured the centuries. Since its initial release, it has virtually gone unchanged.
Parris and Blayney's work was remarkable. To say Parris and Blayney had an enormous task is an understatement. The various printers had contributed a ton of tiny alterations to the text and created a wide variety of inconsistencies across printings. Paris and Blaney needed to re-legitimize the name of the authorized version. Another job taken on by Blaney and Paris was to provide more thorough italicizations of supplied words, words not found in the original languages, but necessary to communicate context. They accomplished this by cross-checking every word against the presumed source texts. On screen are two versions of 1 Corinthians 13. The first is from the 1611 version, and the second from 1769. As you can see, there are many edits in these three verses. Spelling changes, punctuation changes, and typesetting issues that were resolved due to changing standards in the use of U and V. Misprints were even corrected, like in verse 2, with the words "not charity" being replaced with "no charity." Paris and Blaney's standardization of the English version of the Bible brought about consistency and uniformity throughout the entire English language. Their work on the Bible clearly defined spelling and punctuation rules. These two editions of the Bible even helped set the printed English language in stone.
From the 19th century on, the King's Authorized Version has remained almost completely unchanged. The King James Authorized Version has been called the most influential version of the most influential book in the world, in what is now the most influential language, the most important book in English religion and culture, and the most celebrated book in the English-speaking world. Even prominent atheists, such as the late Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, have praised the King James Version as being a giant step in the maturing of English literature. Dawkins has said of the text, "A native speaker of English who has never read a word of the King James Bible is verging on the barbarian." The King James Version crosses over many Christian denominational boundaries. The Orthodox Church in America made it the official translation for a whole generation of American Orthodox. It is authorized by the Episcopal Church and Anglican Communion, among others.
The King's Authorized Version of the Bible is a wonderful example of the stewardship of translators to serve the interest of its reader. A text that is not continually revised and updated throughout the centuries will undoubtedly become outdated or even worse, inaccurate and misleading. New words are constantly being created. Phrases and idioms are constantly changing. Recently, just in a single month, 520 words were added to Webster's dictionary. What was groovy yesterday is cool today. What used to be known as the World Wide Web is now the internet, and a tweet is a sound a bird used to make. Even if you look back at books written in English only 100 years ago, they're almost impossible to read compared to books today. It all changes eventually, and that's what translators face every day.